right, so I think we're going to bring our kind of informal session, intimate session to order. I'm really excited for this because it'll give us more of a chance to interact with Mimi and Scarlett. I'm really excited for this because one of my areas of research is, oh, by the way, my name is Dan Wong, Associate Professor at Columbia Business School, Tamer Center, Co-Director. Okay, anyway, I've been teaching here for 10 years, and
modest.
And my dissertation was about global migration, and I studied in particular people who went abroad and went back to their home countries and the difficulty they had in readjusting to their home countries. Refugees were never a topic of mine, but I was just telling Mimi that next week I'm organizing an academic research conference. Unfortunately, not here. It's at Wharton. Next year it'll be here, and it's for scholars from around the world in business schools who study migration to get together to talk about their research. And the biggest growth area in the field of migration of organizations on refugees, in particular, refugee entrepreneurship and refugee employment in organizations, and pathways to enter society in their host countries. And so I'm really excited because I've never actually had an opportunity to hear from the professional side of the world. And so I'm going to be very engaged. I hope all of you will be here. But let me just turn it over to Mimi. Mimi is amazing because she's one of the co-chairs of our Tamer Center Advisory Board. I've had the pleasure of working with her over the past year in my time at the Tamer Center, and I know that it's going to be an amazing conversation. So take it away, Mimi.
Thank you. Well, I guess first I'd love you to just introduce yourself because just talk about a little bit about your history and how you got to where you are now at Tent.
I would be happy to. So hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And yes, so my name is Scarlett Cronin. My title just changed this week, so I'm just getting used to the new one. It is, I'll make sure I have it right. I'm the Vice President of the Americas and also Vice President of our Global Strategy, which we can talk a little bit more about soon. I've been at Tent 6 years. The founder, Hamdi Ulukaya, the CEO of Chobani, I have a Chobani swell bottle here. He started Tent in 2016. I joined a few months after that. I was very interested in what he was trying to do and what we are now as a group trying to do. And previously, prior to coming to Tent, I had worked at the Clinton Global Initiative and the Clinton Foundation, including down the street on 125th Street for about 11 years in a variety of roles, but mostly working on humanitarian crises and natural disasters. And then prior to that, I had worked at the Elie Wiesel Foundation, so for the Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, and that was a very cool job because it was a 4-person organization. It was Elie Wiesel and his wife, and then me and one other person doing lots of different things. So I got exposure to many aspects of working at a nonprofit, and not born in New York, but raised in New York, and it's fun to be up at Columbia.
That must have been an incredible experience working with his wife.
Yes.
Just given the history.
Yes, she's a powerhouse. I mean, I think continues to be, like such a spiritual leader, but she has a very, very, very smart and acute mind as well. So working for them was really interesting. Yeah.
So, let's talk about Tent for a little bit. Can you just first talk about the mission of Tent and what their vision is for creating this organization?
Yeah, for sure. So as I was mentioning, Tent was founded by Hamdi Ulukaya, the CEO of Chobani, and our mission is ambitious but simple, and it is to mobilize the business community to support the economic integration of refugees around the world. And I think just before I get a little bit more into that, just in terms of how it came to be, Hamdi himself he's not a refugee, although he came to the US in refugee-like circumstances, leaving Turkey for a few different reasons, but including some political beliefs that he had. It would be safer for him to come to the US. Came to the US, has an incredible entrepreneur success story, starting Chobani, had a great success there. But one of the attributes or things that he really says is the reason that Chobani is as strong as it is as a company is because he hired refugees almost from day one. And this was because he really needed workers. This was in upstate New York, he had already hired back everyone in the town that needed to work and was looking for work, but his business was growing so quickly he needed more employees. and heard that there was a refugee resettlement center not too far away, and went there and started talking to them about would this group of people be interested in jobs and employment. And there seemed to be a lot of hurdles at first around languages and translation and transportation. And he's a very, very solution-oriented person. He's a real doer, and just sort of said, like, that's not really a big deal. I just figured it out. We'll get buses. I will get translators for the floor. Let's make this work. So he had a really positive experience with that. And it was really from his own personal experience hiring refugees and just seeing the loyalty and motivation and ethic they brought to his business that he started Tent with the idea of getting more companies and using his vantage point as a CEO to get more businesses involved. So we focus on a few kind of key areas, but I think one important kind of thing about us is that we really try to get companies to go beyond philanthropy. So philanthropy is so important, and there is a need for companies to donate lots of money and lots of things. So in the wake of a disaster, right, recently in Ukraine, diapers, food, medicine, all of that is so critical. There are organizations that do that. That's not our area of expertise. We're not trying to replicate that, but we're really trying to get companies to see the business value in investing in refugees, thinking about them as employees, as customers, as clients, and really leveraging their core competencies as a business. So that's a little bit about the background.
It's really interesting. I came to this, and when Diana asked me to do this, I said, are you sure you want me to do this? Because I know nothing about refugees. Right. But in fact, I think it's actually good that I'm moderating it because I know nothing about refugees and I can ask. But I do see some parallels with a nonprofit that I'm working with in New York with supportive housing for homeless and housing insecure. And many of them are formerly incarcerated. And so it's convincing industry and corporations to incorporate people that have records into their workforce. So I see a lot of parallels. I'm wondering, you can tell me a little bit about what the receptivity has been from the community and from the businesses and how you've handled that.
Yeah, for sure. So 2016 was a bit of a dark year with the election and what it meant here in the U.S., but in other parts of the world too, just in terms of the rhetoric towards refugees, the lies that were put out there about refugees, who they are, where they come from, the Muslim ban, all of that was happening. So I will say I came to Tent, I was so excited, thinking about a new leadership and administration here that was really going to be focused on this mission. And the first couple years were tough. And Hamdi will say that too. It was pretty lonely. He would be making phone calls to other CEOs saying, this is an amazing group of people. You should think about them as talent. You should be hiring them. And it was tough to get traction. So just for a little bit of the numbers, he launched Tent in 2016 with like 10 companies as part of the group. We call it the Tent Partnership. And for about a year, 2 years, we grew a little bit. We went to 80 or 100 major companies. It was a lot of work to get there. But then in the past few years, we've grown to 300 major companies. And now, honestly, like the inbounds that are coming to us, companies that are getting in touch with us saying, we're so excited about what Tent is doing. We are really excited about this as a potential, workforce. We, want to support. We want to get involved. That's really shifted in the past couple of years, and so we've definitely seen a really big change. We've grown our team. Hamdi's investing further, so it's definitely not the same story as it was in 2016. I think that's also because companies want to see their peers that are involved, and I think on like that side of things, peer pressure really does work. So in the hospitality industry, for example, or in a food and beverage industry, once we get a couple of those companies like Pepsi or Coke or Hilton or Marriott, it's much easier to have conversations with their competitors and their peers about also getting involved. So we've made a lot of strides in the past few years. We've been strategic about that too in terms of the types of companies we can be working with.
And you have a very impressive list of companies. So if I'm a company that's never done this before, is there a process for us to support somebody or an entity that hasn't done it?
Yeah, there is. And I think just to talk a little bit more about like what we're actually doing with companies. So we have really narrowed in these past few years on employment. There's a phrase that Hamdi says, and it's really kind of become our ethos, which is that the minute a refugee has a job, they're no longer a refugee. So being able to sustain, for yourselves, for your families, to be able to be productive members of society, to give back, that's really the backbone of what we're trying to do. So we see our mission as trying to make the business case to companies, to get them involved, to be thinking about refugees, again, not just as like victims, but as potential employees, clients, customers, all of that. And so we often work with companies that have never worked with this population before, who don't really know the basics, which is totally understandable in terms of what is a refugee, how is that different to a migrant or an asylum seeker? How do I get in touch with refugees? What do I need to know? What is their paperwork? Can they work legally? So we try to make it as seamless and as easy as possible for companies. So we have a few different things that we do. One is some very, very business-friendly kind of guidebooks for companies. We have them in the US, we have them in Colombia, Mexico, all over Europe and Canada, which is an employer's guide to hiring refugees, which talks through in each country context what you need to know, what do HR teams need to know, what is the paperwork you look for, what are some best practices. So that's kind of like a 101 primer. And then we also do a lot of trainings and tutorials for HR teams, just because we're mostly talking about hiring. So we have a lot of great resources, and we will go present, to L'Oreal or to Unilever or to Pepsi or to Mercedes. It's a bunch of companies that will take us up on this. We will go present to their HR teams about how to create a culturally inclusive workplace. How do you set up refugee employers for success? What do managers need to know? And I'm not saying that it looks entirely different in terms of the curriculum, in terms of some other groups that companies would hire from, but there are certain aspects that we want HR teams to be aware of, and there are certain investments like transportation, language training, that sort of thing, that we can encourage companies to work on. And then we also get companies together on a regular basis. I mean, we probably all hear best practices a lot. It feels like a term that's out there all the time. But having said that, we, in the US, have a coalition of 140 companies that are either already hiring refugees or learning about the process to do so. And so we have monthly calls to share insights, what's working, what's not, with the influx of Afghan refugees last September, and then throughout the year, and then recently Ukrainian refugees, and then there's many others, of course, from different countries and groups, providing kind of specific insights and information for this group. So we're busy, we're doing stuff kind of all the time, and this is in the US and also in other parts of the world.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? So and are there companies, are they mostly multinational companies that are working across country, or?
Yeah, it is mostly multinationals. That's also been our strategy, just because we are very interested in working with companies in multiple countries. So I've already mentioned L'Oreal, but just to talk about them for a second, we got connected to them in France, where they're headquartered, and we're now working with them in the US, as well as in Canada and in several countries in Latin America, both in terms of some supplier diversity initiatives they have to source from refugee-owned businesses, as well as hiring refugees. So we wouldn't turn away a company if they're only in one country, but for us, just in terms of the scale we want to have, it's a little bit better if they can support refugees and integrate refugees into the economy in multiple countries.
I'm wondering, just as an aside, has it been challenging? Because my understanding, and I've lived in America my whole life, but is that some countries aren't as open to opening their doors to refugees or immigrants or whatever it is into their culture and into their economy. I'm just wondering, have you found that as a challenge?
Yes, it is a challenge, and I think for us the biggest challenge actually is legal. So it's not in every country that refugees have the right to work. In the US, the day a refugee comes here from any country in the world, they can work that day. But in several countries, that's not the case, and even if a refugee might be able to work after 6 months or a year, but there's a lag, and then there are some countries, unfortunately, where there's absolutely no right to work. Bangladesh, for example, where there's more than 1 million Rohingya refugees, no work allowed. So unfortunately, we're not able to support companies. Of course, we would never recommend to a company to hire refugees in a country where there's not that legal right. So it really limits our work, but unfortunately even more than our work, it limits the opportunity for refugees in those countries. So we have a good understanding of what that looks like. In some countries, it can be a bit complicated. Like in Jordan, refugees can work in some industries, but not others. And even within some industries, there's restrictions. So that's the sort of stuff that we need to be really, aware of and taking into account. And then I think, unfortunately, as well, but worth saying that public perception can change and shift.
Right.
So some countries might be very welcoming at the beginning, but then there's a recession and there's going to be a negative impact on the views of refugees. So I think for us, we never want to sugarcoat this when we're talking to companies about this issue. And so we do try to look at it on a country by country basis, understanding what are the other factors at play. And we have a really great comms team, because this is also about comms and storytelling and the narrative. We have a wonderful comms team that works with companies about how to message their refugee commitments and work in a way that makes sense within that country context, and perhaps with some other factors to keep in mind. Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, I saw on your website, one of the efforts is with the supply chain. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can talk, because that's really an interesting concept. Yeah. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And then there's something that you guys launched called Unstuck, the Unstuck initiative. Is that related to?
It is, yeah.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you all might know this. I was not a supply chain, I'm not an expert now, but I really knew nothing about supply chains until a few years ago working at Tent. But there's many more jobs that companies have along their supply chain than in their direct operations. And at the same time, most global companies, the multinationals we're talking about here, are sourcing from countries that have emerging markets, and there's an overlay with refugees a lot of the time as well. So like in Turkey or in Colombia, as a couple of examples. So we were very aware of that. And then Hamdi, who is, whether or not you like Chobani, you've probably seen the brand around. He's a very good marketer. He knows how to get the word out to consumers. He's been really interested in this idea of how do you change how people think about refugees? How do you change that narrative? How do you rebrand that? So we launched an initiative called Unstuck this summer, and the goal is to work with brand partners, so companies like Ben & Jerry's or Tony's Chocolonely, for those who know Tony's, great chocolate. And the idea is that these companies will source from suppliers who are hiring refugees, and so the products that are being created are branded Unstuck, and it's a way to create jobs for refugees in countries where there's kind of the most need, and to make sure that those jobs, are not exploitative, all of that, but to be both creating jobs and hopefully changing the minds of consumers about refugees. So we're really excited about it. We launched it in July with 6 brands, all in food and beverage, and that's going to scale to other industries like clothing, retail, healthcare, kind of like beauty, et cetera, that sort of thing.
So really the company has a real influence on kind of bringing in refugees along the supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how much convincing there needs to be and what the
It's a
challenges
tough one.
are.
Yeah, I would say
They have to believe in it first.
Yes.
It sounds like they do.
Yes, they have to believe in it first. Direct hiring still can be a tough conversation, but there's fewer risks. On the supply chain side, it is a tougher conversation, but I think some companies are out at the forefront of it, and they're kind of who we went to first, like a Ben & Jerry's and a Tony's Chocolonely, who's like their awesome brand. And then for others, I think we're in discussion with them to get them on board.
All right. So, bring it a little closer to home, not yet in New York, but we all have this sort of cursory knowledge of the state of refugee integration in the U.S., but now with the crisis in Afghanistan and Ukraine, the actions taken by governors like Texas and Florida, and along the southern border, refugees are once again in the news. We see it all the time. I see it. The Post tends to highlight all of it on the front page. Right. So can you share a little bit about the, refugee status in the context of the U.S. and also how it's affecting you all?
Yeah. Yes, so maybe just to zoom out a little bit. So since 1980, which was when the US instituted the refugee resettlement program that we have, that was under Reagan, we have accepted more than 3 million refugees to the US, which I think is an amazing stat and something we should all be really proud of. And really until the Trump administration, this program enjoyed bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans alike were, very proud of the fact that we were bringing the most vulnerable people here to the U.S. To have a new start at life. And I think we're saying that all refugees that come to the U.S. are vetted for years painstakingly and are fleeing some very, very extreme circumstances. Everyone has made the case that they're being persecuted for different reasons, whether it's their sexual orientation, religious identity, victim of war, et cetera. So that's sort of the backdrop that we were working with, and the kind of annual cap on refugees, which you may have heard a lot about under Trump and recently under Biden, was somewhere around 80 to 120,000 people, which actually in my estimate, in my view, is not that many people, but let's be proud of it. It's definitely a good place to be. And so that was what it looked like kind of historically since 1980. And then under the Trump administration, it was practically decimated, both in terms of the numbers of refugees that were allowed in, but also just the infrastructure that goes into welcoming and accepting and helping refugees get settled, resettled here in the U.S. That was, practically completely taken apart in terms of staffing and capacity and all of that. So the last few years were very catastrophic. It's like,
it sounds like 2022 was just over 22,000.
Yes, and so it's not a big number. So with the current administration that we are in, the sort of sentiment is there, and the infrastructure is being restored, but there's been quite a bit of criticism towards the Biden administration on this in terms of the numbers, but in terms of what we've seen so far this fiscal year, it is a really low number that has come in so far. The goal is to get it back up to where it was next year, and Biden, I think it's more than symbolic, but the number that he has raised it to is back what it was pre-Trump, of even more, 125,000 refugees being accepted each year. So that's one side of it, but then there's this other side, and I think a wonderful part of the last year has been the number of refugees. I will get to the fact that they're not legally refugees, but the number of people that have been have come from Afghanistan and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So 85,000 Afghans arrived since last September, and it's more than 100,000 Ukrainians that have arrived now. So the kind of technical thing here is that unfortunately this group did not arrive under refugee status, where they have things like the right to work and other social protections. They have come under the status called parole, humanitarian parole, which
is that like political asylum, or
it's different? No, it's not, and it's a kind of workaround the government has to get people here very quickly, but they don't have the same access to support. And the right to work is a really big deal in terms of that. So there's a lot of work being done right now to ensure, especially that Afghans, just because this has been going on a bit longer, after 2 years will have the right to remain and the right to work.
So in the meantime, what do they do? They can't work.
In the meantime, they can work, but there's a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen in 2 years, which of course no one needs to go through, to have that mental angst of trying to figure out what's going to happen after 2 years. So there's a bill that will hopefully get passed called the Afghan Adjustment Act that's looking just at that. So I guess just to say, to sum up, the U.S. for decades has been a leader on this issue. Biden has said he wants to restore that again, but we're working our way back up in terms of numbers coming in through the traditional refugee resettlement program, and then there are other types of statuses for which people are coming to the U.S. And at Tent, we are working with all groups. It doesn't need to be refugee status. It could be asylum seekers, temporary protected status. There's many that we're focused on. Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. Yeah.
So something interesting. You are, as part of your work at Tent, you work with potentially refugee entrepreneurs. So can you talk a little bit about what your work is and what some of the challenges and opportunities are for people out there?
Yeah, so I think here this, again, this is not only applicable to refugee entrepreneurs, but just some of the characteristics that, that we've seen that refugee entrepreneurs face is not having, a social network or social capital, which of course, seems quite obvious when someone's coming to a new country and, doesn't enjoy that same kind of network that those would who've been there for a long time.
Just that previous session downstairs was all about, well,
Okay.
maybe it was 2 ago, all about the network and how important that is.
Yes, so that is often something, I don't want to say for everybody that's coming to the US or in other countries a refugee, but that's definitely going to be an issue. And then access to capital. Oftentimes refugees aren't able to get banking support right away because they can't prove their credit. So just in terms of starting a business, all of those basics that you would be thinking about, it's just that much harder for refugees, especially when they first arrived. And then at the same time, we know that refugees, like a broader group of immigrants, have really high rates of entrepreneurship, start a lot of amazing businesses, small and large. And so it is definitely an area to foster. And so there's a few things that we have kind of incubated or worked on with companies to address this. And it is, things like setting up, like a mentorship or small business program for refugees, just to address those very specific needs in terms of connecting them to potential funders, connecting them to mentors, getting feedback on, business pitches, ideas. So I think that looks quite similar to other programs that would exist, for people to start their own small businesses. But then something else that we've seen that's been quite interesting that Ben & Jerry's has done in the UK, and actually now it's in several countries in Europe, is couple an entrepreneurship kind of training program and an incubator program with also having a part-time job, so that at the same time refugees can but get the opportunity to have both access to an income, but then also as the group that they work with is very new in countries, learning language skills, like customer-facing roles, just being able to make it a little bit more in response to the needs that refugees have, in terms of also like maybe wanting to explore a business idea, but also having the really real need to have money in their pocket. So one thing I'll say that we actually launched yesterday is a supplier diversity initiative that we've launched in Canada with TD Bank, one of the major banks there. So what we had seen and were really surprised about, actually, and we didn't discover this ourselves, TD Bank mentioned this to us, is that refugee entrepreneurs and small business owners in Canada actually couldn't apply to be credited as minority-owned businesses. And in Canada, like in the U.S., there's a very big push and interest around major companies to source from businesses that are minority-owned, whether it's women-owned or in Canada Aboriginal-owned. So refugees were not able to apply for this certification because they were not born in Canada. So they were just locked out of that process and that system. So we've been working with TD Bank and an organization that certifies minority-owned businesses in Canada to start a program specifically for refugee entrepreneurs, refugee-owned businesses, so that they can, get in front of those businesses, those major companies that are looking to source from this group of small businesses. So we're looking at a couple things like that. We have at the same time really honed in on our strategy around employment and jobs. So we are trying to find ways that we can support on the entrepreneurship side, especially when it comes to connecting businesses to refugee-owned businesses, major businesses to refugee entrepreneurs. But it's definitely an area that Hamdi's really interested in as an entrepreneur himself. So we're kind of being opportunistic about how we can support in a few different ways.
Part of the supply chain. Just
Yeah.
Fit them right in there.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time? Because I have a few more things, but 20 minutes? Okay, I want to allow time for questions. I think one of the things that, if we bring it even closer to home, so, Mayor Eric Adams just declared a state of emergency in the city because of the influx of migrant asylum seekers sent from Texas and Florida. I'm just wondering, how your organization is dealing with that and what we all can do as citizens or as people in nonprofits or for-profit companies.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very upsetting situation, and we've had a lot of companies reach out to us to ask how they can help, which is fantastic.
New York-based.
New York-based, also some in Chicago and some in DC. So I think the main cities where this is happening, but definitely a lot in New York City. So we've put together just like a two-pager for companies in terms of what they can do to support. So our like the kind of day-to-day work that we do, getting companies to hire refugees, unfortunately does not apply in the situation because most, I wouldn't say all, but most of those who are arriving to New York City or in other cities don't yet have their paperwork to work.
Right.
That is something that would be amazing if it could be expedited. It is something that we are, keeping an eye on, and I know that the mayor asked about. But we can't tell companies, to hire this group, unfortunately, just because they're not legally able to work. But there's a lot that can be done, definitely around volunteering. So getting companies, to volunteer in terms of legal support for those that have that background, as well as I think just providing hours in terms of helping welcome people, let them know in certain languages, mostly in Spanish, I would say, but for others that may have come through the border, there could be other languages too, what they can expect when they come to the city, what are the next steps going to look like. So volunteering from companies, money. I mean, there's a lot of great local NGOs in addition to the city governments who are working on this. As you would imagine, these are NGOs that don't have a lot of support necessarily, but really know the ins and outs of New York City and where, how to best support this group. I know you know quite a bit around housing. So money is useful, and then in-kind donations, whereas that's not something we usually ourselves work on. This is where, providing diapers for babies and providing, food and that sort of thing actually can be helpful. So we are basically directing companies to local NGOs and organizations to support.
And does Tent do anything around advocacy or lobbying to try and push legislation to move things faster, maybe to get filed faster?
Yes, we are having these conversations right now. So we are not, our expertise is definitely not advocacy. I think that is such an important path, and it's just not our expertise in-house right now. But we have been working on stuff for the Afghan Adjustment Act for sure. So it's been more behind the scenes, but we have been engaged there. And in something like this, we would definitely have some conversations.
I think you have a powerful voice in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, it's more that we, in terms of how to best direct like CEOs and companies, we would want to work with organizations that are experts in advocacy, which is what we're thinking about right now, just in terms of how to best leverage the voice. We've done a couple of things over the past few years around advocacy, but I think fair to say they haven't been like huge successes. So we would just want to partner with an organization that best knows how to do this.
So personally, for us in the room, if we want to do something, it's more around providing perhaps funding or some products or.
I think volunteering would be really, really helpful. The numbers are, so I think it's 17,000 people that have arrived in New York City in the past couple of months, and the numbers could get up to 100,000. So just in terms, housing is probably the biggest issue, but just in terms of, this is something that we hear all the time in terms of refugees arriving in countries, just having like a warm welcome is so helpful. So I think, getting involved with an organization, I think there's a lot more that they would be able to direct you all to in terms of like what that looks like, but that I think would be really helpful. Money always goes a long way for NGOs in a crisis, and I prefer giving money to in-kind because I think NGOs know how to spend their money better, but there has been an appeal for quite a bit around the in-kind side as well.
Right. Well, I'd love to open it up to some questions in case people have. Yep. Do you want to just, because they're recording it so they can.
Oh, yeah. Hi. So just to a couple of points with regards to the legal aspects. So just to clarify, most of the work that you're doing is focused on people who would have work authorization because they are in the process of receiving asylum or they've been admitted to the United States as refugees, just for the referrals. So a lot of the work that I work primarily with undocumented communities and with people who have barriers to work who are migrants. And this includes people who are currently refugees in other countries who lack work authorization, like what you were talking about in Pakistan and Bangladesh. People who are waiting across the border because of Title 42 remain in Mexico policy for the past 2 years. They cannot work. So what are the processes, one of the things that, and actually some of the students here at Columbia who are dreamers, who are undocumented, who have business degrees, who have like all of these things, right? When they leave this building, they will not be able to work. So one of the things that like I've been working on for the past few years is developing work cooperative businesses in order to facilitate that. And I'm wondering if that is something that y'all have looked at as a mechanism for inclusion and economic integration, with whether it's within the supply chain or directly like within communities that you're working in.
Yeah, so I think that the thing that we have done that is as inclusive as what you're saying is a mentorship program that we've set up, which is not at all restricted to people that have refugee status or have documentation. So we have set up a program in partnership with other organizations that asks mentors at companies to mentor mentees from all different kind of backgrounds. So, refugees, asylum seekers, I think people that are undocumented as well. And the whole idea is to provide a range of professional support in terms of, career path, all of that. How do you think about a CV here in the US? How are you thinking about, your career? I understand, though, that there's obviously going to be barriers if people are not going to be given the right to work, but that's the program we have in place. And I think a lot of the companies that we're working with, there's a handful that come to mind, are very engaged and working on a lot of legislation and advocacy around Dreamers. So I think that there is that overlap, but it's not something that we have focused on so far as an organization.
Yes.
What relationship, if any, do you all have with the nonprofit resettlement agencies like HIAS or something like that?
Yeah, they're like critical for our work. So we work with all 9 resettlement agencies throughout the US, so at the HQ level and then down to their affiliates. So we, I think depending on where we're having conversation with the company, whether that's in San Diego or in Seattle or somewhere more rural, we're very dependent on the resettlement agencies and their affiliates in terms of being able to identify, their clients, who are refugees to businesses. So they're critical for us when there's actually, dozens of other NGOs that aren't resettlement agencies that we also work with, and that's the same in other countries. Like we are not refugee serving, that's not how we've been set up. So we are very dependent on the organizations that know the local communities really well and working with them. Yeah.
You had mentioned, thank you, by the way.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that one of the primary goals of the 10 Foundation is to connect refugees to employment opportunities, primarily by making the business case for hiring refugees. One of the central themes of this conference is talking about how do you balance this idea of profitability, the business case, with social impact. There are some companies that need no convincing. You mentioned Ben & Jerry's. Others where you really have to lean into the business case. How do you identify that balance, and what are the tactics that you use to make that business case?
We are very, I don't know if aggressive is the right term, but we really lean into the business case just because I think the kind of goal for what we're trying to do is, of course, to have a positive impact on the lives of refugees, but there also are business benefits to engaging this population because they're an amazing population to engage in terms of the skill sets and expertise that they bring. So there's a couple of things we usually bring to our pitch meetings. One is we did a study with the Fiscal Policy Institute a few years ago looking at retention rates of refugees. So anecdotally, we had heard, including Hamdi's own experience, that refugees stay on the job longer, that they're amazing employees, that they have, wonderful attributes that they bring to the job. So we wanted to, look at that a bit more scientifically. So looked across industries and across the United States and found that refugees indeed do stay on the job longer. Their turnover rate is 1/3 of non-refugee employees. So that's an important thing that we can point to. And then for companies that might be nervous about, unfortunately, the impact that engaging on this issue is going to have on their brand, we've done a consumer perception study. I have to say it's with NYU, so not with Columbia, but with NYU's business school. We did a consumer perception study in several countries, but including in the US, where consumers were asked how likely or unlikely they were to purchase from brands that support refugees, taking a number of different activities, and found, we really didn't know what we were going to get. We're about to get the results back again because this was a few years ago, but it was a pretty good story to tell, especially among millennial consumers, which is not surprising, but kind of across religious affiliations, across age groups. It's a good story to tell, except for the one thing that was negative was when consumers were asked how they would respond in terms of purchasing towards brands that advocate for more refugees to come to the U.S. Unfortunately, that was the dip. Other things were positive, but we'll see what the results are, how that's changed in the past few years. So
Is that across demographics too, even among young?
yeah, and we no, not among young, if I'm remembering correctly. We have a lot of really good data there. There's some of the reports on our website, but if people are interested, happy to dive into that. But I think the new results are coming out in the next couple of months, and then we've also looked at that in Latin America as well as in Europe. So that's another interesting one, that if we're going into a conversation like with Unilever, we would be looking at what the consumer goods brands kind of responses were versus other companies. So we use that a lot.
I mean, I always think of, people always say France is very closed, and I'm just wondering how the data.
The results in France were not great.
Not great.
Not great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
it's
yes.
consistent
It,
with,
yes.
with the perception.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe in the back, and then Sandra.
Hi. Oh boy. Thanks, Scarlett. Thanks for the talk. I'm wondering more of a personal question. It seems like the kind of common theme of your career has been working with and serving this population. And I'm wondering what has been the more fulfilling moments, what have been the more challenging moments, and kind of what the decision was for you early on to get into this career path.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I definitely didn't have like a clear vision of anything. I think I just got lucky in working in interesting and very different organizations. So I knew I wanted to do something that felt like positive, and I was giving back, even though I think that term is a little, we need a new term for that. But that's kind of been the thread. And then I think for me, honestly, it's been like as much what I do as who I work with. And I really loved the environment at the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative. It was really, really smart, driven people. And I don't think everyone got everything right, but it was a very, very driven group. And I really enjoyed that. And then I've been interested in kind of building that up at Tent. So when I started at Tent, we were 2 people, and now we're 30 and growing. So still small, but it's been I think for me that's been really exciting to have gone from being more junior and not kind of in positions where I was thinking about the growth of an organization to now doing that. It's been really rewarding, and I think hopefully we've brought in a really diverse and interesting group of people. I think we have mostly actually with the business background. I'm one of the only people on the team that has the nonprofit background. We've been really interested in bringing in people to that across the board. There's some exceptions, but who could kind of understand how we are going to pitch companies and hold their feet to the fire. So a lot of people with corporate backgrounds. Yeah. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I think for me, I never really had a plan. I was just trying to be moved and driven by things that I found interesting and being persistent. I definitely been persistent. I haven't, with both the Clinton Foundation and my current position, I tried a few times to get there. Yeah.
I'm curious as to how you work with employers with some segments of the population of refugees who might have experienced trauma. So, for example, women who have been sexually trafficked right across borders. And also, if you could maybe talk about the tension between that issue and grappling with that issue and what we call the business case.
Yeah. I mean, so in the U.S., for example, one of the things that we've done with the coalition of companies is, bring in experts who very much would not be us, but experts from the diaspora community or the community talk to employers about the types of trauma that you might expect that people have faced or gone through. And of course, it's not going to be the same for everybody, and it's not going to look the same across the board. But I think part of our job is educating employers about that for those that might not be thinking about it. So we have done that at multiple touch points, throughout the past year. And in Europe, with the work we're doing, it looks similar. So for us, it's about finding the right kind of local organizations that can help to educate employers and encourage them to think about what they offer to their employees. Is there some sort of, system internally in place, or is there some, programs that can be provided around like mental health and all of that? So that's really more the role that we play. Like, we are not involved, I would say, like in a very frontal way, but it's more about encouraging employers to think about it, and creating a space for employers to share among themselves too what they maybe have set up for their employees as a way to inspire others. And in terms of the tension, there might be some, but I think that we are not hearing that back as much, and maybe that's also because we are not refugee serving. Like our day-to-day is hearing back from companies about their experience, and then with our mentorship program, which has now reached a few thousand refugees, and I should have mentioned this, but we have focused on the LGBTQ community here first, and now refugee women, as well as Afghans and Spanish speaking. We're getting quite a bit of feedback from mentees about what they would find to be more helpful and more useful, and feeding that back into companies.
More questions? So Ivy?
Hi, thank you again for your insights. You had mentioned a little bit about the growth of Tent, starting from 2 employees to where you are today. And I'm sort of curious where you would like to go from here. So unfortunately, there's no shortage of refugees, but are you looking to go into other directions like advocacy, or is it mostly a scaling proposition?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's both. I think it is scaling, but also going deeper with the companies that we work with. So, there's 300 companies, but like, what are those companies doing? What is the impact they're having? What does that actually, look like? So that's been part of the reason for expanding the team, is to actually be able to provide more resources and support to companies to help them see through, if they start up a refugee pilot hiring program, what does that look like in 6 months? How can we scale that? So it is about scaling, and I think like getting better at the work that we do now that we've been around for a few years, and I think have a lot of learnings. And then I think with something like advocacy, we have played around with it and engaged a little bit over the past few years, and there are some live conversations going on right now about what that could look like and the role that we could play. So I think we're definitely interested in something like that. Unstuck is, I think, has a lot of potential if we can kind of get it over the phase it's in right now, in terms of like the narrative change and how people are thinking about refugees and that whole aspect of it. So there's a lot more I think that we could do there, and on like the supply chain side, which we just haven't. I will be very transparent in saying we haven't been very successful so far in working with companies on that. So I think we definitely would like to expand. We have a brainstorm with Hamdi next week, actually, about the next few years at Tent. So I'm sure it will evolve and look a little bit different than it does now. But I think we have also realized that we have built up this expertise over the past few years around the employment side of things, and want to continue to see that through.
Well, Scarlett, this has been really enlightening for me. I'm sure I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time. And I guess you guys can have a sidebar if you want after, but I think there's another session after, so we're going to break now. But thank you all for